A millionaire loses everything after a stroke and decides to disappear without a trace. Until a 10-year-old girl shows up with an old book and says she can make him walk again. What starts as a game turns into a miracle, and he rediscovers what it means to walk with dignity. If this story intrigues you, be sure to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. Now, on with the story. The mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, had always been known for its elegant parties, the imported cars parked along its circular driveway, and the lights that illuminated the gardens late into the night. It was the kind of property featured in architecture magazines, with its expansive double-paned windows, an infinity pool that seemed to merge with the horizon, and a privileged view of the Long Island Sound that stretched from the avenue to the distant lights of the Manhattan skyline. The neighbors used to comment on the events held there, always with that mix of envy and admiration that characterizes those who watch from afar. Politicians, entrepreneurs, celebrities, they had all passed through that imposing wrought iron gate. But in recent months, everything had changed so drastically that even passers-by on the street could tell. The lights now remained off most of the time, giving the modern structure a somber, abandoned look. The gardens, once impeccable and tended by a team of landscapers who came twice a week, were beginning to show signs of neglect. The roses that once bloomed in symmetrical beds now grew wild, leaves piled up in the corners of the empty pool, and the silence that filled the wide hallways and spacious rooms was so heavy, so oppressive, that even the few staff members who still worked there spoke in whispers, as if afraid to awaken something best left sleeping. Edward Taylor was 52 years old, with a fortune built over 3 decades of relentless work, the kind that consumes entire days, nights, and weekends without distinction. He had started from scratch, as so many like to claim in interviews and motivational speeches, but unlike most who just repeat the cliché, Edward truly had. He was the son of Anthony Taylor, a bus driver on the route that cut across the Long Island Expressway, and Maria, a seamstress who worked from home mending the neighborhood's clothes for a few extra dollars. Edward grew up in Queens, watching his father leave before dawn, when the streets were still empty and dark, and return exhausted at dusk, his back aching and his feet swollen. His mother would sew late into the night, her eyes red from straining in the dim light of the bulb hanging over the old Singer sewing machine. The apartment where they lived had 2 tiny bedrooms, a living room that also served as a sewing workshop, and a kitchen so small it could barely fit a table. Edward shared a room with his 2 younger brothers. He was the oldest, the one who was supposed to set an example, the one who carried his parents' silent hope that life could be different for the next generation. And Edward took that responsibility so seriously that he turned it into a personal mission. He swore to himself one night, after hearing his mother crying softly in the kitchen because she didn't have money for his father's medicine, that his life would be different, radically different, and it was. He graduated from NYU's Stern School of Business with a full scholarship, earned after months of studying 14 hours a day, sacrificing leisure, friendships, relationships. All that mattered was getting in. And he did. He didn't just get in. He was at the top of his class. He entered the financial market as an intern at a small brokerage firm near Wall Street, where he spent the first 6 months making coffee, running copies, and organizing files no one else wanted to touch. But Edward watched everything. Every meeting, every negotiation, every strategy. He learned while serving coffee. He took mental notes while organizing papers. And when he finally got the chance to present his first market analysis, he impressed the partners so much that he was promoted to junior analyst in record time. From there, it was a dizzying climb. Edward ascended each rung with the hunger of someone who intimately knew the taste of want, of someone who had watched his parents age prematurely from hard labor and constant worry. By 25, he was a senior analyst. By 28, a manager. At 30, he made the leap that would change everything. He pooled his savings, secured loans, convinced 3 investors to bet on him, and opened his own investment and financial consulting firm. The first few years were brutal. He worked 16, 18 hours a day. He slept at the office more often than he slept at home. He ate cold sandwiches in front of his computer. But the results began to show. His clients profited. His analyses proved accurate. His name started circulating in the right circles. By 40, Edward was an advisor to multinational corporations, gave keynotes at international events, and was frequently cited in specialized columns as one of the most brilliant entrepreneurs of his generation. By 50, his name wasn't just known. It was synonymous with success, strategic vision, and concrete results. But success has a price that doesn't always appear on the profit and loss statement, that isn't accounted for in financial disclosures, that doesn't factor into the annual balance sheet. Edward worked so hard with such intensity and absolute dedication that he forgot to live everything that couldn't be measured in numbers. He married once at 35 to Jennifer, a lawyer he met at a corporate dinner. It was a beautiful wedding, celebrated at a historic church downtown, followed by an elegant reception at one of the city's finest hotels. But the union lasted only 3 years. Jennifer grew tired of dining alone, of celebrating her birthday alone, of waking up in an empty bed more nights than not. She didn't just want the last name and the bank account. She wanted a husband, and Edward didn't have time to be one. The divorce was civilized, almost cold. They signed papers, divided assets, and each went their own way. Edward had no children. There was no time, no emotional space, no visceral desire that some people carry. He didn't have time to cultivate true friends either. He knew hundreds of people, of course. His phone was always full of contacts. But real friends, the kind who call just to see how you are, the ones you can vent to without fear of judgment, they didn't exist. Or if they once did, they were left behind somewhere on the climb. His family was reduced to Beatrice, his younger sister, 11 years his junior, who had always admired him from a distance with that mix of pride and incomprehension. Beatrice had followed a completely different path. She married young, had 2 children, and worked as a literature teacher at a private school on the Upper West Side. She and Edward spoke on the phone occasionally, saw each other at Christmas and maybe a birthday or two. Beatrice never understood why her brother needed so much. Why wasn't it enough to have a comfortable life, a nice house, time to enjoy it? But she never had the courage to ask. She respected his choices, even if she didn't agree with them. The only relationships Edward truly cultivated were professional. Strategic meetings, multi-million-dollar contracts, complex acquisitions, delicate mergers. He was good at it. Maybe too good. Maybe dangerously good. Because when his body finally demanded a break, when it sent clear signals that he needed to slow down, Edward simply ignored them, just as he ignored everything that got in the way of his plans. It was on a Tuesday morning, a day that began like any other in that relentless routine, during a video conference with foreign investors based in London and Tokyo, that Edward felt the first sharp pain in the back of his neck, a piercing, acute pain, as if someone had driven a hot, sharp needle into the base of his skull, right where the spine meets the brain. He blinked several times, trying to focus on the computer screen, where serious faces awaited his analysis of the Asian market fluctuations, but the words began to blur. The letters danced on the screen, multiplying and merging into incomprehensible smudges. His left arm, which was holding a pen ready to jot down something important, grew heavy, absurdly heavy, as if it had been filled with molten lead. The pen dropped to the floor with a dull thud that seemed to echo forever. His mouth no longer obeyed his commands. Edward tried to ask for help, tried to say that something was wrong, very wrong, but the sound that came out was an unintelligible groan, a sequence of nonsensical syllables that frightened him more than the pain in his neck. He tried to get up from his chair, a desperate impulse to seek help, but his legs didn't respond. It was as if his brain was shouting orders that his body simply wasn't receiving. And then, losing his balance completely, Edward fell. His assistant, Valerie, a competent woman who had worked with him for 7 years, was in the next room reviewing documents. When she heard the dull, heavy thud of his body falling from the chair, followed by the sound of objects being knocked off the desk, she dropped everything and ran. When she opened the office door, she found Edward on the floor, lying on his side, his eyes wide with absolute panic, conscious, tragically conscious, but completely unable to move or speak. The diagnosis came after an exhaustive battery of tests, MRIs, CT scans, and neurological analyses conducted by a team of specialists. Ischemic stroke. The words were delivered by Dr. Henry Miller, a renowned neurologist at Mount Sinai Hospital, with that professional tone doctors use when they have to deliver bad news but can't allow themselves to show too much emotion. He had survived, and that in itself was considerable luck, they told him. Many patients don't survive. Others survive, but lose all consciousness, the ability to reason, to recognize people. Edward was fully conscious. He understood everything. He could think, analyze, process information. But the left side of his body was compromised. Partial paralysis, the doctor explained, caused by the interruption of blood flow to a critical region of the brain responsible for motor functions. The doctors at Mount Sinai were cautious in their predictions, choosing each word carefully, but they were also honest, brutally honest. They said that with intensive physical therapy, 5 or 6 sessions a week with specialized professionals, proper and rigorously administered medication, and a lot of determination, an immense amount of determination and patience, he might recover some mobility. Maybe he could move his arm again. Maybe he would regain some strength in his hand. Maybe. But walk again? Walk without support? Climb stairs? Do the simple things anyone does without thinking? That was uncertain, probably unlikely. The chances were statistically minimal. Dr. Miller didn't say impossible because doctors avoid that word, but it was in his eyes, in his posture, in his tone of voice. He was saying that Edward needed to accept a new reality, a reality on wheels. Edward spent 3 long months alternating between modern hospitals with rooms that looked like hotel suites and specialized rehabilitation clinics where everything smelled of antiseptic and forced hope. He hired the best physical therapists money could buy, internationally recognized professionals, some of whom flew in from other states just to work with him. He invested in equipment imported from Germany and the United States. Expensive and sophisticated machines that promised to stimulate dormant nerves and rebuild neurological connections. He followed every protocol to the letter, with the same military discipline he had always applied to his business. He woke up early, did the exercises even when it hurt, even when the frustration was so great he wanted to give up. He took his medications at the exact times. He took notes on every minimal progress, every small victory, but his body, stubbornly, did not respond as expected. His legs remained inert, dead weight he had to drag with effort when trying to transfer from the bed to the chair. His left arm trembled constantly, a fine tremor that worsened when he tried to hold something. His hands wouldn't obey. His fingers wouldn't close properly. The frustration, initially channeled into more effort, more dedication, more attempts, slowly turned into anger. Anger at the doctors who couldn't cure him. Anger at the physical therapists who smiled while saying he was improving when he clearly wasn't. Anger at his own body that had betrayed him, that had crumbled just when he needed it to be strong. And the anger slowly, painfully began to transform into resignation. That bitter resignation of someone who realizes they fought as hard as they could and still lost. When he finally returned to the mansion in Greenwich, 6 months after the stroke, Edward was no longer the same man. Not just physically, which was obvious to anyone who saw him, but internally. Something fundamental inside him had broken along with the neurons that commanded his movements. Something that not the best doctors, nor the most expensive equipment, nor all the determination in the world could fix. The wheelchair became his prison. He hated every inch of that cold, functional metal. He hated depending on other people to get dressed, to shower, to cross a room. Edward had always been the man who solved problems, who gave orders, who was in control. Now he couldn't even control his own body. The feeling of helplessness was corrosive. He began to push people away. He dismissed the physical therapists, claiming there was no more progress. He stopped answering calls. He cancelled appointments. Gradually, he shut himself inside his own house, inside his own pain. It was Beatrice who insisted he hire someone to help with the cleaning and organization of the mansion. Edward resisted. He didn't want strangers roaming his house. He didn't want looks of pity. But his sister was firm. She said if he didn't agree, she would move in herself, and Edward knew that would be even worse. Beatrice had good intentions, but her constant presence suffocated him. She treated him like a fragile child, and that irritated him deeply. So he relented. He agreed to have a housekeeper come 3 times a week. Mrs. Davis arrived on a Monday morning, carrying a worn cloth bag and a shy smile. She was in her early 40s with brown hair tied in a simple bun and calloused hands from a lifetime of hard work. She introduced herself politely, without asking unnecessary questions, and began to work in silence. Edward watched her from a distance, from the library where he spent most of his days. She was efficient, discreet, and seemed to understand without anyone needing to explain that he didn't want to talk. That pleased him. What he didn't expect, what he could never have imagined or predicted, was the girl who would change everything. In the 3rd week, on a Wednesday morning that started overcast and threatened rain, Mrs. Davis showed up with a child. A small girl too thin for her age, with messy braids that looked like they'd been done in a hurry, and a wrinkled school uniform that spoke of a long day at public school. Edward frowned deeply when he saw her trail in behind her mother, carrying a heavy backpack that seemed too big for her, and a book with a worn frayed cover under her arm. He didn't like it. He hadn't asked for children in his house. He had no patience for noise, for questions, for the chaotic energy that children usually bring. Mrs. Davis approached him in the library, where Edward spent his mornings staring out the window without really seeing anything. Embarrassed, wringing a cleaning cloth between her nervous hands. She apologized several times, her voice low and apologetic, explaining that the public school had let out early because of a serious plumbing problem that had flooded 2 bathrooms and part of a hallway, and she had no one to leave her daughter with. The grandmother who usually watched Isabella was in the hospital for a minor surgery. The neighbors were at work. She had no choice. She promised, crossing her heart, that the girl would be quiet, absolutely quiet, wouldn't bother anyone, wouldn't make a sound. She could stay in the kitchen and read, and Mrs. Davis would finish her work as quickly as possible. Edward sighed deeply, annoyed by the situation but too tired to argue, and waved his hand in an impatient gesture of permission. He didn't have the patience, didn't have the energy to deal with it, but he also knew Mrs. Davis was a good employee in a tough spot. As long as the child made no noise, as long as she remained invisible, it didn't matter. He turned his attention back to the window, to the heavy clouds that promised a storm. The girl's name was Isabella. Edward only found out later when he heard Mrs. Davis call her. She was 10 years old, with tan skin and dark eyes that seemed too large, too deep for her small, delicate face. There was something in that gaze, a strange, almost unsettling intensity that didn't belong to a child. She sat in a corner of the kitchen, on a chair against the wall, opened her book carefully, as if handling something precious, and stayed there completely still. Quiet, as a shadow. Edward almost forgot she was in the house. Almost. Because later, when he rolled his motorized chair into the living room to watch the garden through the panoramic window, trying to find some kind of peace in the view that once calmed him, he heard a strange noise from the wide hallway, a soft sound of bare feet on the cold marble. He turned slowly, expecting to see Mrs. Davis, but instead, he found Isabella standing there, a few feet away, staring at him intently. He expected her to look away, as people usually did when they saw him in the chair. He expected that expression of discomfort, of poorly disguised pity, of embarrassment that he saw in everyone's eyes. But the girl didn't look away. She watched him with an intense, almost scientific curiosity, as if she were studying something, trying to decipher a puzzle. Edward felt uneasy. He didn't like being watched like that. He didn't like being analyzed like an object of interest. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice coming out harsher than he intended. The girl didn't answer immediately. She just stood there until she finally said, in a thin but firm voice, "I can make you walk again." Edward blinked. For a moment he thought he had misheard. He looked at the child, incredulous, waiting for her to explain, to say she was joking. But Isabella remained serious, her eyes fixed on him. He felt a wave of anger rise. What kind of cruel joke was this? A child saying she could cure him when the best doctors in the country had already said it was impossible. Edward spun his chair around abruptly, turning his back to her. "Get out of here," he said, his voice thick with bitterness. But the girl didn't leave. She took a step forward and repeated with the same conviction, "I can make you walk again." Edward turned back, this time with a cynical smile on his face. He was tired, angry, fed up with empty promises and false hopes. He decided that if this child wanted to play doctor, he would end the game once and for all. "All right," he said, his voice drawling. "If you cure me, I'll give you everything I own, everything. The house, the money, the cars, all of it." He expected the girl to back down, to realize the nonsense she was spouting, but Isabella didn't back down. She tilted her head slightly as if considering the offer, and then said something that made Edward's blood run cold. "I don't want what you have. I want who you are." The silence that followed was dense. Edward didn't know what to say. Those words coming from a 10-year-old child had a weight he couldn't comprehend. He opened his mouth to say something sarcastic, but nothing came out. The girl continued to look at him without fear, without pity, just waiting. Before he could react, Mrs. Davis appeared in the hallway, wiping her hands on a cloth. She saw her daughter there, standing near Edward, and rushed to pull her by the arm. "Isabella, I'm so sorry, Mr. Taylor. She didn't mean to bother you. I told her to stay quiet." Edward raised a hand, cutting her off. "It's all right," he said, his voice strangely calm. "She wasn't a bother." Mrs. Davis looked relieved, but still pulled her daughter firmly back toward the kitchen. Edward was left alone in the living room, his heart beating faster than it should. He looked down at his own legs, inert on the chairs, footrest, and felt a mixture of contempt and something else, something like curiosity. In the following days, Edward couldn't stop thinking about those words. "I don't want what you have. I want who you are." What did that mean? What did a child know about who he was? He wasn't even sure himself. Before the stroke, Edward was his job, his achievements, his bank account. Now, what was left? A man trapped in a chair, bitter, alone, waiting for time to pass. The next week, Isabella returned with her mother. This time she didn't wait in the kitchen. When Mrs. Davis started cleaning the upstairs bedrooms, the girl appeared again in the living room where Edward was. He saw her arrive and pretended not to notice, but he could feel her gaze on him. "You're in pain," she said bluntly. Edward turned, surprised. "How do you know?" "You furrow your brow on the left side, and your hand trembles. My grandmother used to say that's a sign of built-up muscle tension." Edward narrowed his eyes. "Who was your grandmother?" "She was a nurse. She served in the war. Not World War II, the other one. The one nobody talks about. Much." Edward didn't know which war the girl was talking about, but something in the way she mentioned her grandmother caught his attention. There was respect in that voice, reverence. Isabella wasn't making it up. She truly believed what she was saying. "Did she teach you anything?" Edward asked, more out of curiosity than hope. "She taught me everything. She said the body has a memory. Even when the mind forgets, the body remembers. And if you know where to touch, where to press, you can wake that memory up." Edward let out a short, humorless laugh. The girl was unfazed. "You don't believe me," she said, as if stating a fact. "No," he replied, "I don't." "That's okay. But will you let me try?" Edward should have said no. He should have sent the girl away, asked Mrs. Davis not to bring her anymore. But there was something in the determination of those dark eyes, something that made him hesitate. Maybe it was the boredom. Maybe it was the loneliness. Or maybe, deep down, he still held onto a tiny thread of hope, so thin he was afraid to admit it even to himself. "Do whatever you want," he said, turning back to the window. "But don't expect anything." Isabella didn't answer. She simply approached, pulled a stool close to the chair, and asked him to take off his shoe. Edward complied, more out of curiosity than conviction. The girl carefully took his left foot, rested it on her lap, and began to press specific points on the sole, the toes, the heel. Her fingers were small but firm. She seemed to know exactly where to touch. At first, Edward felt nothing, but after a few minutes a strange sensation began to spread through his leg. It wasn't pain. It was something different. A light tingling, as if thousands of tiny needles were waking something that had been dormant. He looked at the girl, incredulous. "You're feeling it," she said without looking up. "That's good. It means there's still life in there." Edward didn't reply. He just sat there, silent, letting those small hands continue their work. When she finished, almost half an hour later, he felt strangely tired, as if he had exerted himself physically. "It's going to be sore tomorrow," Isabella warned, standing up. "But it's a good sore. It's the body remembering it exists." She picked up the book she had left on the floor and left the room without another word. Edward was left alone, staring at his own legs, not knowing what to think. Had that been real, or just suggestion? He shook his head, trying to push the thoughts away. He couldn't let himself be fooled by false hope. He'd been through that before. But that night, as he lay in bed, he felt it. A dull, deep ache rising up his left calf. It wasn't the sharp, terrifying pain of the stroke. It was something different. Something that, as strange seemed, made him feel alive. He touched his leg, squeezed it lightly, and the ache intensified. But with it came a sensation he hadn't experienced in months. Sensation. He was feeling his own leg. Edward closed his eyes and, for the first time since the stroke, allowed himself to think that maybe, just maybe, there was still a way back. He didn't know if he believed in that girl. He didn't know if any of it made sense. But he knew that on that night, he had felt something the doctors said he would never feel again. And that, however, small, was something. When Isabella returned the following week, Edward didn't pretend he wasn't waiting for her. He was in the living room, in the same spot, and when he saw her enter, he just nodded. She approached, pulled up the stool again, and repeated the process. This time Edward paid attention to every movement, every point she pressed. There was a logic to it. A sequence. It wasn't random. "Where did you learn this?" he asked, breaking the silence. "From my grandmother," she replied, concentrating. "She took care of a lot of people nobody else wanted to care for. Soldiers who came back different from the war, people the doctors said would never get better. But she didn't give up. She used to say that as long as there's life, there's a fight." Edward was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "And did she cure everyone?" Isabella paused, looking up at him with those serious eyes. "No, she didn't cure them. She helped their bodies cure themselves. Some people don't want to be cured, and then there's no technique that can help." Edward felt the weight of those words. Did he want to be cured, or had he, deep down, already given up? He didn't know the answer, but he knew that for the first time in months someone was looking at him not as a broken man, but as someone who could still be fixed. The sessions became a routine. 3 times a week, when Mrs. Davis came to work, Isabella would arrive with her and spend an hour with Edward. She didn't talk much, just worked. Pressing, massaging, stretching. And slowly, very slowly, Edward's body began to respond. The tingling became more frequent, the soreness more constant. And on a rainy Thursday afternoon, as Isabella worked, on his ankle, Edward felt something that made him hold his breath. His foot moved. It was a tiny movement, almost imperceptible, but it was real. Isabella saw it and smiled. It was the first time Edward had seen her truly smile. He, in turn, felt his eyes burn. He didn't cry in front of her. But when he was alone that night, alone with that foot that had moved on its own, he cried. He cried with relief, with fear, with hope. He cried because, for the first time since the stroke, he believed that maybe he could go back to being who he was, or at least discover who he could be now. And it was all because of a 10-year-old girl who didn't want what he had, but who he was. Edward still didn't fully understand what that meant, but he was beginning to find out. Edward turned back, this time more slowly, a cynical smile forming on his tired face. He was exhausted. Exhausted from hopes that never materialized, exhausted from promises that proved empty, exhausted from waking up every day in a body that wouldn't obey. He decided that if this child wanted to play, doctor, if she wanted to pretend she had magic powers, he would end the game once and for all. He would show her how the real world worked, how pretty promises didn't heal anyone. "All right," he said, his voice drawling, heavy with sarcasm. "If you cure me, I'll give you everything I own, I mean it. The house, the money, the cars, the stocks, the investments, everything in my name. You can have it all." He expected the girl to back down, for her eyes to widen in fear, for her to realize the nonsense she was spouting and run back to the kitchen where she should have stayed. But Isabella didn't back down. She showed no fear, no surprise, none of the reactions Edward expected. She just tilted her head slightly to the side, as if seriously considering the offer, weighing each word, and then said something that made Edward's heart leap in his chest, something that left him utterly speechless. "I don't want what you have. I want who you are." The silence that followed was so dense, so charged, that Edward could hear his own heart pounding in his ears. Those words, coming from a 10-year-old child, with messy braids and a wrinkled uniform, had a weight he couldn't comprehend, a depth that frightened him. He opened his mouth to say something sarcastic, some cutting retort to put the girl in her place, but nothing came out. The words were stuck in his throat. Isabella continued to look at him without fear, without pity, without judgment, just waiting, as if she had all the time in the world, as if she knew he would eventually understand what she was saying. Before Edward could react, before he could fully process the strange encounter, Mrs. Davis appeared in the hallway, nervously wiping her hands on a damp cloth. She saw her daughter there standing near Edward, much closer than she should be, and rushed to pull her forcefully by the arm. "Isabella, my goodness. I'm so sorry, Mr. Taylor. She didn't mean to bother you. I've told her 1,000 times to stay quiet in the kitchen. I don't know what's gotten into her today." Edward raised a hand, cutting off the stream of apologies. "It's all right," he said, his voice strangely calm for someone who had been irritated just seconds before. "She wasn't a bother." Mrs. Davis looked visibly relieved, but still pulled her daughter firmly back toward the kitchen, whispering a scolding under her breath as they walked away. Edward was left alone in the spacious living room, surrounded by the heavy silence that had dominated the house for months, his heart beating faster than it should. He looked down at his own legs, inert and useless on the padded footrest of the chair, and felt a confusing mix of self-loathing and something else, something like curiosity, something dangerously like hope. In the following days, Edward couldn't stop thinking about those words that echoed in his head, like a disturbing mantra. "I don't want what you have. I want who you are." What did that mean? What did a 10-year-old know about who he was? He wasn't even sure himself. Before the stroke, Edward was his job, his monumental achievements, his impressive bank account, the zeros accumulating on his statement. He was the important meetings, the multi-million-dollar contracts, the decisions that moved markets. Now, trapped in that chair, dependent on others for the most basic things, what was left? Who was Edward Taylor without everything that had always defined him? A broken, bitter, lonely man waiting for the days to pass until there were no more days left. The next week, when Mrs. Davis arrived for work on a sunny Thursday morning, Isabella came with her again. This time, there were no embarrassed apologies or hurried explanations. The girl was just there, carrying her worn backpack and that frayed book that seemed to be her constant companion. Edward saw her enter through the library window and felt something strange in his chest. It wasn't irritation. Maybe it was anticipation. He wouldn't admit it, not even to himself, but he had been wondering if she would come back, if he would get another chance to understand what this strange child had seen in him. Isabella didn't wait in the kitchen like last time. When Mrs. Davis started cleaning the upstairs bedrooms, heading up the stairs with her cart of cleaning supplies, the girl appeared in the living room where Edward was, standing at the entrance with that strangely confident posture for someone so small. He saw her arrive and pretended not to notice, keeping his gaze fixed on the book in his lap that he hadn't actually been reading for at least 20 minutes. He could feel her eyes on him, persistent, assessing. "You're in pain," she said without preamble, her voice breaking the silence like a stone thrown into still water. Edward turned slowly, genuinely surprised. "How do you know that?" "You furrow your brow on the left side, and your hand trembles when you think no one is looking. My grandmother used to say that's a sign of built-up muscle tension. The body tenses up, trying to compensate for what doesn't work right." Edward narrowed his eyes, studying the girl with renewed interest. She didn't talk like a child. There was a precision in her words, a confidence born of real knowledge, not childish fantasy. "Who was your grandmother?" he asked, his curiosity overcoming his skepticism. "She was a nurse, Augusta. She worked in 3 different wars, caring for soldiers who came back wounded. Not World War II, those other conflicts nobody talks about much. The ones that happened far away but hurt a lot of people. She saw men who had lost limbs, who were paralyzed, who had given up on living. And she never gave up on them. Never." Edward didn't know exactly which wars the girl was referring to. Her grandmother must have been much older than he imagined, or perhaps she had participated in medical missions in international conflicts. But something in the way Isabella mentioned this grandmother, with that deep respect in her voice, that almost sacred reverence, caught his attention. The girl wasn't making up stories to impress him. She truly believed what she was saying. There was truth there. "Did she teach you anything?" Edward asked, now with genuine curiosity rather than hope. Hope was still too far out of reach. "She taught me everything she knew. Before she passed, she spent months teaching me. She said the body has a memory, that even when the mind forgets how to do things, the body remembers. The cells remember, the muscles remember, the nerves remember. And if you know where to touch, where to press, how to awaken that dormant memory, you can make the body remember how it was before it forgot." Edward let out a short, dry, humorless laugh. It sounded like cheap mysticism, like the promises of faith healers who sell false hope to desperate people. The girl was unfazed by his reaction. She didn't seem offended or discouraged. "You don't believe me," she said, as if simply stating an obvious fact, not judging or criticizing. "No," he answered with brutal honesty. "I don't. I've heard a lot of promises, Isabella. I've spent a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of energy believing in things that didn't work. I don't have any more hope to waste." "That's okay," she replied with disarming simplicity. "But will you let me try anyway?" Edward should have said no. Any sensible person would have said no. He should have sent the girl away, asked Mrs. Davis not to bring her anymore, and returned to his empty routine of staring out the window and waiting for time to pass. But there was something in the determination of those dark eyes, something in the posture of that thin child who didn't beg or insist, but simply offered, that made him hesitate. Maybe it was the suffocating boredom that dominated his days. Maybe it was the corrosive loneliness eating away at his chest. Or maybe, buried deep in his tired soul, he still held onto a tiny thread of hope, so thin and fragile that he was afraid to admit its existence even to himself. "Do whatever you want," he said finally, turning to the window in a gesture of false indifference. "But don't expect anything from me. Don't expect gratitude, don't expect progress, don't expect miracles." Isabella didn't respond with words. She simply approached with silent steps, pulled a low stool that was leaning against the wall, and positioned it near the wheelchair. She asked with a polite but firm gesture for him to take off the shoe and sock from his left foot. Edward complied, more out of morbid curiosity than any conviction that this would lead anywhere. The girl carefully took his foot, resting it on her lap with surprising gentleness, and began to press specific points on the sole, the toes, the heel, following some invisible map that only she seemed to know. Her fingers were small, childlike, but firm and precise. She seemed to know exactly where to touch, how much pressure to apply, when to pause. At first Edward felt absolutely nothing. It was as if those small hands were working on a piece of dead wood, not living flesh. But after a few minutes of constant, patient pressure, a strange sensation began to spread slowly through his leg. It wasn't exactly pain. It was something different, something he couldn't name. A light, subtle tingling, as if thousands of tiny needles were prodding something that had been dormant for a long time, trying to awaken what everyone had said would never wake up again. He looked at the girl, incredulous, frightened by what he was feeling. "You're feeling it," she said without looking up from her work, completely focused on what she was doing. "That's good. That's very good. It means there's still life in there. It means there's still a connection. The nerves didn't die completely, they're just in a very deep sleep. Edward didn't answer because he didn't know what to say. He just sat there completely silent, barely breathing, letting those small, determined hands continue their mysterious work. When she finished, almost half an hour later, he felt strangely tired, as if he had done some intense physical exertion, as if he had run for miles or lifted heavy weights. His whole body was trembling slightly. "It's going to be sore tomorrow," Isabella warned, standing up and wiping her hands on her uniform. "But it's a good sore, it's growing pains, it's the body remembering it exists, that it's still alive, that it can still fight." She picked up the worn book she had carefully placed on the floor and left the room without another word, without waiting for thanks or acknowledgement. Edward was left alone, staring intently at his own legs, as if they were alien objects he didn't fully recognize, not knowing what to think. Had that been real, or just a powerful suggestion, a psychological placebo? He shook his head vigorously, trying to banish the dangerous thoughts that were beginning to form. He couldn't let himself be fooled by false hope again. He'd been through that before. He'd believed in treatments that promised the world and delivered nothing. He wasn't going to fall into that trap again. But that night, as he lay in the king-size bed that now seemed too large and empty, he felt exactly what she had predicted. A dull, deep ache, slowly rising up his left calf like hot lava flowing down a forgotten path. It wasn't the sharp, terrifying pain of the stroke, the pain that came with panic and mental confusion. It was something completely different, something that, as strange and contradictory as it seemed, made him feel more alive than he had in months. He touched his leg with trembling fingers, lightly squeezed the tense muscle, and the ache intensified in response. But along with it, inseparably intertwined, came a sensation he hadn't experienced since before the stroke. Real sensation. Concrete. Undeniable. He was actually feeling his own leg. Edward closed his eyes in the darkness of the room, and for the first time since waking up in that hospital with a broken body, allowed himself to think that maybe, just maybe, there was still a way back to a place worth reaching. He didn't know if he fully believed in that strange girl. He didn't know if any of it made any logical or scientific sense, but he knew with absolute certainty that on that night he had felt something that all the expensive, renowned doctors had categorically said he would never feel again, and that, however small and fragile, was definitely something real. When Isabella returned the following week, arriving on a Monday morning with the bright sun streaming through the windows, Edward didn't pretend he wasn't waiting for her. He wasn't pretending anymore. He was in the living room, sitting in the same strategic spot where he could see the entrance, and when he saw her appear with her worn backpack and her frayed book, he just nodded in silent acknowledgement. She approached without hesitation, pulled up the low stool again with growing familiarity, and repeated the methodical process. This time Edward paid meticulous attention to every movement, every exact point she pressed, trying to memorize the sequence. There was a clear logic to it, a recognizable pattern. It wasn't random, it wasn't improvisation, it was real technique, transmitted knowledge. "Where exactly did you learn this?" he asked, breaking the respectful silence that had settled between them. "From my grandmother," she replied, staying focused on her work, her fingers moving with surgical precision. "She took care of a lot of people nobody else wanted to care for, people the hospitals sent home saying there was nothing more to be done, soldiers who came back completely different from the wars, changed forever, people the doctors said would never get better, that they should just accept their new reality and move on. But she didn't give up. She never gave up on anyone. She used to say that as long as there's life, as long as the heart beats, and the lungs breathe, there's a fight. There's always a fight." Edward was silent for a long moment, absorbing those words, feeling their weight. Then he asked the only thing that really mattered. "And did she cure everyone? Did everyone she treated get better?" Isabella paused her work momentarily, lifted those dark, serious eyes, and looked directly at him with a brutal honesty that was both refreshing and frightening. "No. She didn't really cure anyone. She helped the body cure itself, find its own way back. But some people don't really want to be cured. Some people have already chosen to give up. They've accepted defeat. They prefer the chair because it's easier than the fight. And then there's no technique in the world that can help. No massage, no pressure, no hope is enough. Edward felt the brutal weight of those words fall on him like a ton of bricks. Did he really want to be cured? Or had he, in the dark, honest depths of his tired soul, truly given up? Had he chosen the chair because it was more comfortable than facing the possibility of failing yet again? He didn't know the answer. He wasn't sure what he wanted. But he knew that for the first time in endless empty months, someone was looking at him not as an irreversibly broken man, not as a lost cause worthy only of pity, but as someone who could still potentially be fixed, like a devastated field that could still be replanted. The sessions quickly became a sacred routine, a ritual that neither of them mentioned, but both deeply respected. 3 times a week, always on the same predictable days, when Mrs. Davis came to work in the silent Greenwich mansion, Isabella would arrive with her and spend exactly 1 hour with Edward. She didn't talk much beyond what was strictly necessary, didn't ask invasive or curious personal questions, just worked with that intense, determined concentration that seemed to belong to someone much older. She pressed specific points, following some invisible map, massaged atrophied muscles from prolonged disuse, stretched stiffened tendons that had forgotten their original function, and slowly, so slowly, it was almost imperceptible, day to day, but absolutely undeniable when Edward stopped to look back and make comparisons. His body began to respond in ways that deeply surprised even him, who no longer expected anything. The tingling became more frequent, more intense, gradually spreading to areas that were previously completely dead, zones of total darkness. The pain, paradoxically, became more constant and present. But it was that specific pain Isabella had predicted from the beginning, growing pains, the pain of something arduously coming back to life after a long winter, not of something inexorably dying. And then, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, when the sky was heavy with dark clouds and the rain beat hard against the large windows, creating a rhythmic, hypnotic sound, while Isabella worked intently on his left ankle, applying constant, circular pressure, Edward felt something that literally made him hold his breath. His foot moved. It was an absolutely minimal movement, almost imperceptible to any outside observer, barely a centimeter of displacement. But it was real, undeniably real. It wasn't an involuntary spasm. It wasn't a random tremor. It was a conscious, directed, intentional movement. His brain sent the command, and for the first time in months that felt like years, his foot obeyed. Isabella saw it immediately and smiled. It was the first time since they had met that Edward had seen her truly smile. Not just a polite upturn of the lips, but a genuine smile that completely lit up her small, serious face. She said nothing. She didn't need to. She just continued her work, as if that small miracle was exactly what she had been expecting from day one. Edward, for his part, felt his eyes burn dangerously, a growing pressure in his throat, tears welling up that he fought desperately to control. He didn't cry in front of her. He maintained his composure with Herculean effort. But when Isabella finished the session and left the room silently as she always did, when he was completely alone in that huge empty house, alone, with that foot that had moved on his own command, he finally let the tears fall. He cried silently in the growing darkness of the rainy afternoon. He cried with deep, overwhelming relief. He cried with paralyzing fear that it was just an isolated moment that would never be repeated. He cried with dangerous, fragile hope that he had tried to kill, but that stubbornly insisted on resurrecting. He cried because, for the absolute first time since the stroke that had divided his life into before and after, he truly viscerally believed that maybe he could go back to being who he was, or at least, and perhaps this was even more important, discover who he could be now in this new version of himself that was being painfully rebuilt. In the following days, Edward secretly experimented when he was alone, trying to reproduce that magical movement. Sometimes it worked, other times it didn't. But each small victory, each minimal movement, was celebrated internally as a monumental achievement. He started writing everything down in a notebook he kept hidden in his desk drawer. Date, time, what movement he managed, how long it lasted, how strong it was. He was documenting his own resurrection with the same meticulousness he once applied to his multi-million-dollar investments. The house began to subtly transform as well. The heavy, oppressive silence was gradually replaced by voices, by clumsy but sincere attempts at conversation, by shy smiles that appeared unexpectedly. Edward started asking Isabella questions about school, about the books she read with such devotion, about her dreams. She answered with her characteristic seriousness, telling him she wanted to be a doctor one day, that she wanted to help people like her grandmother did, that she wanted to prove that ancient techniques and traditional knowledge still had value in a world obsessed with technology and novelty. Edward found himself actually listening, actually caring about the answers, something he hadn't done with anyone in years. But not all transformation happens without resistance. Not all progress is met with applause. Edward's improvement, however subtle and gradual, began to attract unwanted attention from people who thought they knew what was best for him. It was Beatrice who noticed first. She had started visiting her brother more frequently, worried about his isolation, and on a Saturday afternoon, when she showed up unannounced, she found Edward in the living room, in a session with Isabella. She saw the girl working on him, her small hands pressing his leg, and was immediately alarmed. "What is going on here?" she asked in a loud, concerned voice, walking into the room unceremoniously. "Edward, who is this child? What is she doing to you?" Edward tried to explain, tried to tell her about the progress, about the movements he could now make, about the good pain that meant life was returning. But Beatrice wouldn't listen. She was already convinced her brother was being taken advantage of, manipulated in a moment of vulnerability. She called, for Mrs. Davis demanded an explanation and threatened to call the authorities if it didn't stop immediately. Mrs. Davis turned pale, terrified at the prospect of losing the job that supported her and her daughter. Then Dr. Henry Miller, the neurologist from Mount Sinai who had treated Edward from the beginning, showed up. Beatrice had called him secretly, asking him to come and assess the situation. The doctor arrived on a Monday afternoon, elegant in his dark suit, carrying that natural authority that renowned professionals cultivate over decades. He examined Edward, asked technical questions, reviewed the medical records, and then, when he heard about Isabella and her treatments, his expression visibly hardened. "This is absolutely unacceptable," he said, his voice laced with professional indignation. "This is the illegal practice of medicine. This child has no training, no license, no authorization to touch a patient, let alone one in a case as delicate as yours, Edward. She could be causing irreversible damage. She could be compromising your real recovery. This needs to stop immediately." Edward tried to protest, tried to explain that he was getting better, that he was feeling things he hadn't felt before, but his words were ignored, dismissed, as the delusions of a desperate man clinging to false hopes. Dr. Miller was categorical. Either it stopped, or he would be forced to take legal action. Beatrice fully supported him, saying it was for her brother's own good, that she wouldn't allow him to be exploited in such a cruel way. When Isabella arrived the next afternoon for her regular session, she found Dr. Miller waiting at the entrance with Beatrice by his side. He confronted her harshly, accusing her of charlatanism, saying what she was doing was a crime, that she was playing with the health of a vulnerable person. He tried to physically remove her, his words growing harsher and more accusatory, threatening her mother with lawsuits, with reports to the proper authorities, with serious consequences. Isabella tried to explain about her grandmother, about the techniques, about the real results. But no one wanted to listen to a 10-year-old girl challenging a renowned doctor. The girl was sent away crying, something Edward had never seen before. She had always been so strong, so controlled, so self-assured. Seeing her leave like that, with tears streaming down her face, being pulled away by her terrified mother, who muttered desperate apologies, broke something inside him. Mrs. Davis also left that day, saying between sobs that she couldn't work there anymore, that she couldn't risk her daughter, that she had to protect her family. The house plunged back into absolute suffocating ice. The silence returned even heavier than before, because now Edward knew exactly what he was losing. He felt like a traitor, a coward, powerless. He had allowed them to drive away the only person who was actually managing to help him, who believed in him when no one else did. Beatrice tried to console him, saying she had done the right thing, that she had protected him. But Edward could barely look at his sister. He sent everyone away. He was left alone in the living room where Isabella used to work, staring at the empty stool, feeling her absence like an open, pulsating wound. But then, when he tried to move his foot that night, his trembling hand reached out on its own toward the door where the girl had last left, reaching into the void, searching for something that was no longer there. And in that moment of painful clarity, Edward finally understood what she had said weeks ago. "I don't want what you have. I want who you are." She didn't want his money, his house, his material possessions. She wanted him to become human again, to feel again, to care again, to fight again. And he was starting to do that. The recovery wasn't just physical, it never was. It was emotional, spiritual, existential. Isabella was rebuilding not just his legs, but his forgotten soul. And he had let them send her away. No, it couldn't end like this. Edward picked up the phone with trembling hands and called Mrs. Davis. He begged, pleaded, for her to come back, to bring Isabella back. He said he didn't care about Dr. Miller, about Beatrice, about anyone. He said he would protect the girl, that he would take full responsibility, that no one would threaten them again. Mrs. Davis hesitated, understandably afraid, but the urgency in his voice, the genuine need, convinced her. He brought Isabella back that same day, sending his driver to pick them up personally. When the girl entered that house again, she was visibly hesitant. Her eyes still red from crying, but her chin was held high in stubborn determination. Edward was waiting for her in the living room, and when their eyes met, he said simply, "I'm sorry, I should have defended you. It won't happen again." Isabella studied him for a long, silent moment, and then said in that firm voice he knew so well, "If we don't do the stretches now, the muscles will lock up again. The pain will come back worse. All the progress we've made could be lost in a matter of days. The body forgets quickly when it stops practicing." She was right. She was always right. From that decisive moment on, Edward began to protect her as fiercely as if she were a valuable war ally, someone essential to his survival. When he heard new staff members laughing at her, making jokes about the girl who thought she was a doctor, he fired them on the spot without a second chance. When a reporter from a local gossip paper found out what they were doing through some resentful, fired employee and threatened to expose the story as a scandal, Edward didn't try to hide or deny it. On the contrary, he invited the man to watch a full session, to witness it with his own eyes. The reporter, a middle-aged man named Robert, was so moved by what he saw, the girl's dedication and the visible results in Edward, that he voluntarily offered to write an article, not as a sensationalist exposé, but as a sincere tribute to the power of human determination. The relationship between Edward and Isabella changed completely after that traumatic episode with Dr. Miller and Beatrice. It was no longer just a tacit agreement between a desperate man and a determined child. It had transformed into something deeper, a genuine alliance built on mutual trust and respect. Edward no longer saw Isabella as just the housekeeper's daughter with a strange technique. He saw her as his salvation, his second chance, the person who believed in him when he didn't even believe in himself. And Isabella, in turn, began to treat him not as a project, but as someone who truly mattered to her. The sessions continued with military discipline, but now there was a different lightness in the air during their meetings. Edward told stories of his poor childhood in Queens, of his bus driver father's struggles, of his seamstress mother's unfulfilled dreams. Isabella listened intently while she worked, and sometimes shared her own stories. She spoke of her grandmother Augusta with that deep reverence, told him how the old woman would teach her on Sundays in their small house upstate, showing her on old dolls where the important pressure points were, how to identify muscle tension by touch, how to read a person's body like an open book. One day, while massaging Edward's calf muscle with warm rosemary oil she prepared herself at home following her grandmother's recipe, Isabella said something that made Edward stop breathing. "My grandmother knew your father," she said calmly, as if commenting on the weather. Years ago, when he was admitted to that VA hospital in the Bronx, he'd had a serious heart problem during a bus trip. He almost didn't make it, She took care of him for 2 whole weeks, applying the same techniques I'm using on you now. When he was discharged, he brought her flowers every day for a month. White roses. She kept all the letters he wrote thanking her. Edward felt a violent tightness in his chest. His father had had a serious heart problem about 15 years ago, he knew that. He had been hospitalized for weeks in a hospital whose name he couldn't even remember. But never, not for a moment, had he imagined there could be this connection, this invisible thread linking his family to Isabella's across time. "Are you saying your grandmother saved my father's life?" he asked, his voice trembling with emotion. Isabella nodded simply. She said she owed him a debt, not of money but of recognition. Your father was one of the few who truly thanked her from the heart, who treated her like a person, not an employee. That's why before she passed she made me promise that if I ever met you I would try to help. She knew you existed. She had seen pictures your father proudly showed her. She said that if that good man's son ever needed it, I should be there. Edward couldn't hold back the tears this time. He cried openly without shame, letting the emotion overflow without restraint. It all made sense now. Isabella's determination wasn't just technique or a calling. It was the fulfillment of a sacred promise, honoring the memory of the grandmother who had saved his father decades ago. It was karma, destiny, or whatever you wanted to call that mysterious force that weaves impossible connections between people who should be strangers. He held Isabella's small hand and said in a broken voice, "Thank you, not just for me, for everything, for keeping the promise, for not giving up, for being who you are." Edward's physical progress began to accelerate impressively after that day. It was as if the revelation had unlocked something deep within him, a motivation that went beyond the simple desire to walk. He wasn't just regaining movement. He was honoring the memory of the father he never had the courage to properly thank before it was too late. He was living up to the faith an old army nurse had placed in him without ever having met him. He was proving that the promise was worth it. First, he managed to move all the toes on his left foot, not just a timid twitch, but real control. Then, his ankle began to respond with basic flexes. His thigh, which had been an inert mass of forgotten muscles, began to contract when he mentally commanded it. The physical therapy sessions with Isabella increased in intensity. She introduced new, more challenging exercises, resistance bands, lightweight strapped to his ankle, movements that required increasing coordination between brain and muscle. Edward would wake up every day at 5 in the morning, an hour before Isabella arrived on her days, and practice the exercises she had taught him alone. He would sweat, grunt with effort, sometimes fall out of bed trying to position himself for the stretches, but he always got back up. He didn't give up. The mansion that was once a silent mausoleum began to pulse with life again. Edward hired back some staff, but this time he chose people Mrs. Davis recommended, humble people who didn't judge, who didn't look with pity or suspicion at the 10-year-old girl leading the recovery sessions. Beatrice tried to reconcile with her brother several times, calling, showing up unannounced, sending long apologetic texts. Edward eventually forgave her, but he made it clear that he would never again allow her to interfere with his treatment or disrespect Isabella. The relationship between the siblings cooled considerably, a necessary distance that Edward accepted as the price of his newfound autonomy. It was on a sunny October morning, 3 months after Isabella began her treatments, that the impossible happened. Edward was sitting on the edge of the bed, Isabella beside him holding his right arm firmly for stability, when he managed to push his body up using his own legs and stood, not leaning on anyone, not holding on to anything, standing on his own, albeit trembling, albeit for only 15 seconds before his legs gave out and he fell back onto the bed. But they were 15 seconds of pure miracle. Isabella screamed with joy, a high-pitched, childish shriek so rare from her that it startled Mrs. Davis down in the kitchen. Edward laughed. For the first time in almost a year, he let out a real, loud, liberating laugh. They hugged, that 52-year-old man and that 10-year-old girl, united by a journey that no one else could fully understand but them. But life, as Edward had painfully learned over the years, rarely allows happiness to exist without complications. Just when everything seemed to be finally on the right track, when recovery was not just a hope, but a tangible reality, a challenge arose that would test everything he had achieved so far. A week after that historic day he stood up, Edward received a call from Mark, his oldest business partner and a friend from his college days. The investment firm Edward had founded was still operating under interim management since the stroke, but a crucial moment was approaching. There was a major corporate event in 2 weeks, a gala dinner at the Plaza Hotel with international investors, potential strategic merger partners, and the specialized press. Edward's presence was not just desired, it was absolutely vital. His absence had already been noted in the market, generating worrying rumors about the company's health. If he didn't show up at this specific event, if he didn't show that he was still in control, investors might start pulling capital. Competitors could exploit the situation, and everything he had built over 30 years could begin to crumble. Edward listened to all of this in heavy silence, the phone trembling slightly in his hand. Mark wasn't being cruel in his pressure. He was just being honest. The situation was critical, the company needed him. But how could he go? He could barely stand for 15 seconds. How could he appear at an event full of people, cross a ballroom, get on a stage to give a speech? "I'll go in a wheelchair," he said finally, his voice laced with a resignation he tried to disguise as practical acceptance. Mark was silent for a long moment before answering carefully. "Edward, you know I respect you deeply, and if you go in a chair, everyone will support you. But you also know how the financial market works. Image matters, confidence matters. If you show up in a chair, some will see strength and resilience, but others, especially the more conservative investors, will see fragility. They'll start to question if you're still fit to lead decisions that move millions. Is it unfair completely? Is it reality? Unfortunately, yes." Edward hung up the phone, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders again. He had 2 weeks, 14 days to achieve what seemed impossible. Not just to stand, but to walk far enough to enter the ballroom, cross to the stage, give his speech, and leave with dignity. It was 20, maybe 25 yards at most. For any normal person, a trivial walk. For him, a terrifying marathon. When Isabella arrived for the afternoon session, Edward told her everything. He expected her to say it was too soon, that he wasn't ready, that he needed more time. But the girl surprised him, as she always did. She was silent for a long time, those thoughtful dark eyes analyzing the situation, and then said with absolute conviction, "Then we start training today. It's 25 yards. We have 14 days. It's tight, but it's possible. But you're going to have to work harder than you've ever worked. You're going to have to trust me completely, and you're going to have to be willing to feel a lot of pain." They started that same day. Isabella measured out 25 yards in the wide ground floor hallway of the mansion, marking the start and finish, with colored tape on the marble floor. "This is your challenge," she said, pointing. "From start to finish, 2 weeks. We'll break it into stages. First week, you need to be able to stand on your own for at least a minute without falling. Second week, we start taking steps. On the day of the event, you're going to cross this on your own." Edward looked at those 25 yards that suddenly seemed like an insurmountable distance. He felt fear, doubt, but he also felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Adrenaline. The same adrenaline he felt when closing a difficult deal, when risking everything on a calculated bet. He was back in the game. "Let's do this," he said. And for the first time in months, he completely believed his own words. The following days were the most intense and painful since the stroke. Isabella became a relentless general, a coach who accepted no excuses and allowed no self-pity. She came every day, not just 3 times a week, but every single day, including weekends. She brought her backpack full of books in case she had to wait, but she rarely had time to read. Edward trained, morning, afternoon, and night. He stood holding onto parallel bars he had installed in the hallway. He timed how long he could maintain his balance. First, it was 30 seconds, then 45. On the 3rd day, a full minute. On the 5th day, a minute and a half. His legs trembled violently. His muscles burned as if on fire. Sweat poured down his face, his back, soaking his shirts. Edward fell frequently, his body hitting the cold marble floor hard, but he always dragged himself back to the starting position. Isabella didn't help him up unless it was absolutely necessary. "Do it yourself," she would say, without pity but with disguised love. "Your body needs to learn that it can. If I do it for you, it will never learn." Mrs. Davis watched from a distance with teary eyes, proud of her daughter, but also worried about the intensity of it all. Edward would sometimes see her standing at the top of the stairs, wringing her hands nervously, and he would give her a thumbs up to show he was okay. He knew the pain of extreme effort. He had lived that pain when he built his empire from scratch. He knew the difference between destructive pain and constructive pain. This was construction. On the 8th day, Edward took his first real steps. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't graceful. He staggered like a toddler learning to walk, his arms outstretched for balance, his face contorted in absolute concentration. Isabella walked beside him, ready to catch him if he fell, but without touching him. Her words were firm commands. "Don't look at your feet. Look where you want to go. Feel the floor, you don't need to see it. Trust your body, it knows what to do." Edward managed 3 steps before his legs gave out, but they were 3 glorious steps. The next day it was 5 steps. On the 10th day, 8 steps. The progress was slow, painfully slow, but it was progress. The body was remembering. The muscles were rediscovering forgotten patterns. The nerves were reconnecting interrupted pathways, but fate, as if to test the limits of Edward's determination, had one final, cruel obstacle in store. On the 11th day, with only 3 days left before the event, while practicing his steps with redoubled intensity, trying to do more than his body was ready for, Edward felt something pop in his left ankle. A sharp pain, different from the good pain Isabella always talked about, shot through his leg like lightning. He fell immediately, crying out, clutching the ankle that was already beginning to swell visibly. Isabella rushed to examine it, her small fingers palpating the area with a professional care that belied her age. Her face, usually so controlled, showed real concern. "You pushed too hard. The tendon is inflamed. It could be a serious injury. You need ice now. Absolute rest and probably a few days of recovery before you try to walk again." Edward felt panic rise. "A few days? I don't have a few days. The event is in 3 days. 3 days, Isabella." "I know," she replied calmly but firmly. "But if you keep pushing now, you could tear the tendon completely. Then it won't be 3 days. It will be months, maybe years. The body has limits. You have to respect them." Edward wanted to scream, to hit something, to curse the entire universe. He had come so close, so absurdly close, and now, just when he needed it most, his body had betrayed him again. He looked at the 25 yards marked on the floor, that ridiculously short distance that had seemed so achievable yesterday and so impossible today. He thought about giving up, about accepting defeat, about going to the event in a wheelchair and letting the market judge him however it wanted. But then Isabella did something unexpected. She sat on the floor beside him, right there on the cold marble, and took his trembling hand in her small ones. "If you stop now," she said with that ancient wisdom, "if you let the fear win, your body will rust, it will forget everything it's learned. But if you rest today, if you let the inflammation go down, if you trust the process, we still have a chance. A small one, but a real one. You won't be able to train physically for the next 2 days, but you can train mentally. My grandmother called it visualization. You close your eyes and you walk in your mind. You see every step, feel every movement. The brain doesn't know the difference between doing it for real and imagining doing it. The same neural pathways are activated. For the next 2 days, you will walk 1,000 times in your head. And on the day of the event, you'll just be doing in real life what you've already practiced 1,000 times in your dreams." Edward looked at her, incredulous. It sounded absurd. How could imagining walking prepare the real body? But after everything they had been through together, after all the times Isabella had proven she knew exactly what she was doing, even when it seemed impossible, he decided to trust her one more time. "All right," he said with a tired sigh. "We'll do it your way, but if it doesn't work, I'm going in the chair, and that's that." Isabella smiled. "It will work. But you have to believe it will work. You can't just pretend. You have to really feel it. The next 2 days were the strangest of the entire journey. Edward stayed in bed or in his wheelchair, his ankle wrapped and elevated, with ice packs applied religiously every 3 hours. Isabella came several times a day, not to make him walk, but to guide him through intense visualization sessions. She had him close his eyes and described in rich detail every step of the walk he would have to take. The sound of his shoes, on the carpet, the texture of the floor under his feet, the weight of his body shifting from one leg to the other, the low chatter around him, the lights of the ballroom, the stage approaching. Edward followed her instructions, diving deep into the visualizations. At first it was hard to maintain focus. His mind constantly wandered, but gradually, with Isabella's calm voice guiding him, he managed to create a mental image so vivid it felt real. He saw himself entering the plaza, greeting acquaintances, crossing that enormous ballroom with confidence and dignity. He felt the carpet under his feet. He heard the murmur of the crowd. He reached the stage, turned, smiled. On the first day he imagined it about 50 times. On the second day, more than 100. Each repetition became clearer, more detailed, more real. The night before the event, Edward barely slept. Not just from nervousness, but from a vibrant anticipation. A rational part of him still doubted that this could really work, that 2 days of mental visualization could compensate for the lack of physical training. But another part, a deeper part that Isabella had awakened in him over those months, believed with a faith he didn't know he still possessed. In the morning at 5:30, when the sky was still tinged with pink and orange, she arrived before the sun had fully risen. She brought a bag of fresh herbs she had picked herself at dawn from a vacant lot near her house, and carefully prepared a poultice to apply to his still slightly swollen ankle. The strong medicinal scent of rosemary mixed with arnica filled the spacious room, bringing a strange sense of peace despite the tension of the day ahead. She worked in absolute silence, focused, massaging gently but with purpose, preparing that injured body for the greatest challenge it would face. "How are you feeling?" she finally asked after half an hour of silent work. Edward thought honestly before answering. "Scared," he said. "More scared than I was when I was closing multi-million-dollar deals. More scared than when I started my company, not knowing if it would succeed. Because this isn't about money, Isabella. It's about dignity. It's about proving that I still exist, that I still matter. If I fail today, if I fall in front of everyone, I don't know if I'll be able to get up again." Isabella stopped what she was doing and looked directly into his eyes with that intensity that always completely disarmed him. "You're not going to fall," she said with a certainty so absolute it was almost convincing. "Because you've already fallen. When you had the stroke, when you were stuck in the chair, when you gave up on everything, you've already fallen as far as you can fall. Everything you do now is climbing up, and climbing hurts more than falling because falling is fast and climbing is slow. But you've been climbing for 3 months. Today is just another step, an important step, but it's no different from all the others you've already climbed." Edward held her small hand and squeezed it tightly. "You're 10 years old. How do you know these things?" "My grandmother used to say that age has nothing to do with wisdom. Some people live 100 years and learn nothing. Some people live 10 and learn everything they need to. She taught me to pay attention. You learn more by observing than by talking." The day passed with torturous slowness. Edward tried to distract himself by reviewing company documents, answering accumulated emails, talking on the phone with Mark about the final details of the event. But his mind always returned to those 25 yards, to that impossible walk that would determine so much of his future. At 3 in the afternoon, he began to get ready. He chose a navy blue suit that had always brought him luck in important negotiations, a white Egyptian cotton shirt, a discreet burgundy tie. He spent almost 15 minutes just tying the knot, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Isabella appeared at 4, dressed differently than usual. She had swapped her school uniform for a simple but neat dress that her mother must have sewn especially for the occasion. Her hair was in a tidy bun. She looked older like this, more serious, if that was even possible. "I came to be with you," she said simply. "I'll be there, at the back of the ballroom. You probably won't see me, but I'll be there." And when you're walking, you'll remember all those times we practiced together. You'll remember that the body knows what to do. Edward felt a lump in his throat. You don't have to go, Isabella. This isn't about you. You don't need to worry. Of course. It's about me, she replied with disarming simplicity. If you can walk today, I prove my grandmother was right, that her techniques work, that ancient knowledge still has value. This is as important to me as it is to you, maybe even more. The car that would take Edward to the hotel arrived at 5:30. It was a dark, spacious Mercedes, driven by Walter, the driver who had worked with him for 15 years. Walter helped Edward into the back seat. Isabella and Mrs. Davis would take a separate taxi. The drive to the plaza took 40 minutes because of traffic. Edward spent the entire time doing the breathing exercises Isabella had taught him, trying to calm his racing heart. Mentally, he walked those 25 yards one more time. When they arrived at the hotel, there was already a small cluster of luxury cars at the entrance, photographers taking discreet pictures, security guards organizing the flow. Edward could see through the window people entering the main lobby, executives he had known for years, all walking normally, oblivious to the absurd privilege of putting one foot in front of the other without effort. Walter opened the door and assembled the wheelchair. Beside it, Edward looked at the metal that had been his prison for so many months. A part of him wanted to just accept it, get in the chair, go to the event without drama, without risking ridicule. But then he remembered Isabella's words. You've already fallen as far as you can fall. Everything now is climbing up. He took a deep breath, gripped the silver cane he had specially made for this day, and said in a voice that tried to sound firmer than he felt, We're walking, Walter. Leave the chair in the car. Walter's eyes widened in surprise and concern. Are you sure, Mr. Taylor? It's a long way in there, and there are stairs too. There's a ramp, Edward corrected, because he had carefully studied the hotel's layout. And I'll go slow, but I'm walking. Walter wanted to argue more, but something in Edward's expression made him stop. The driver just nodded and offered his arm for support. Edward slowly got out of the car, planting his feet firmly on the ground, feeling the weight of his own body supported by legs that still trembled but obeyed. He was standing at the entrance of an event, with hundreds of people, without a wheelchair, after 9 months. The walk from the car to the main door was harder than any visualization. It wasn't 25 yards, it was maybe 10 yards at most. But each step felt like a mountain. The injured ankle protested with sharp pain. His legs trembled violently. He held tightly to the cane and Walter's arm. People started to notice. They recognized Edward Taylor, and the murmurs began. But he kept going, painful step after painful step. When he finally reached the entrance, when he crossed that threshold, Edward felt a wave of relief, mixed with pride. He had done it. The first part was done. Inside the hotel, the main lobby was exactly as he remembered from the visualizations: polished marble floors, crystal chandeliers that looked like suspended stars, a subtle scent of expensive flowers. But now he had to face the real challenge. From the lobby to the main ballroom where the event was held were the 25 yards. And this time, it wouldn't be with Walter's support. Mark had been clear. When Edward entered the ballroom, it had to be alone, or at least appearing to be alone. Image mattered. Edward took a deep breath, adjusted his tie, and turned to Walter. I'm on my own from here, he said, his voice coming out firmer than he expected. You can wait at the ballroom entrance. If I fall, you pick me up, but it won't be necessary. Mr. Taylor, Walter began, worried, but Edward raised a hand to stop him. Trust me, I need to do this. Edward started walking toward the ballroom, using the cane for support, but forcing his legs to bear most of the weight. It was exactly as Isabella had described, the thick carpet under his feet, the muffled sound of conversations coming from the ballroom, the feel of the suit on his body. He didn't look down. He looked ahead, at the double wooden doors that marked the entrance to the ballroom. 10 yards. 15 yards. His legs began to tremble more violently. Sweat ran down his forehead despite the strong air conditioning. 20 yards. That's when he stumbled. His left foot didn't lift high enough and caught the edge of the carpet. His body started to tip to the side, his balance completely lost. Edward felt the floor approaching, felt the panic rise, imagined himself fallen there in the middle of the hallway while everyone watched. But then, in a reflex that came from he knew not where, his free hand gripped the cane tightly. He planted its tip on the floor and pushed, redistributing his weight, forcing his body back into an upright position. He almost fell. But he didn't. He regained his balance, trembling, paused for a second to breathe, and continued. 2 more steps, 3, 4, and then he was there, at the entrance to the ballroom. The doors opened automatically as he approached, and on the other side was a sea of elegant people talking in groups, holding champagne flutes, turning to see who was arriving. And when they saw it was Edward Taylor, when they saw him standing, walking, albeit with a cane and obvious difficulty, the entire ballroom fell progressively silent. The conversations died down one by one like candles being extinguished. Everyone was watching. Edward stopped there at the entrance, feeling the weight of all those eyes. For a moment he wanted to run back to the chair, to safety, to the comfort of the victim role that doesn't have to prove anything. But then, at the very back of the ballroom, almost hidden behind a decorative column, he saw Isabella. She was standing, still too small to be noticed by most, but visible to him. Their eyes met across the crowd, across the distance, and she did something simple but powerful. She slowly raised her closed fist, a gesture of strength, of solidarity, of absolute belief. Edward felt something explode inside his chest. It wasn't just courage, it was gratitude. It was love. It was the recognition that he wasn't alone on this journey, had never been. He smiled. Not a forced smile of a businessman at a corporate event, but a true, genuine smile that lit up his tired face, and he began to walk toward the stage that was set up at the other end of the ballroom. The crowd parted automatically. No one spoke. They just watched this man who had disappeared broken and was now returning on his feet, fighting his own body with every step, but always moving forward. Edward didn't look to the sides. He kept his focus fixed on the stage, exactly as Isabella had taught him. 1 step, another step. The pain in his ankles screamed, but he ignored. His muscles burned, but he continued. He was doing this for himself. He was doing it for Isabella. He was doing it for the father he never properly thanked. He was doing it for the promise an old army nurse made decades ago. When he reached the stage, when he climbed the 3 steps holding tightly to the railing, when he finally turned to face that sea of faces watching him in stunned silence, Edward looked up and from the back of the ballroom saw Isabella still there, still with her fist raised, still believing. He approached the microphone. At the center of the stage, held the cane firmly to maintain his balance, and said just 3 words in a firm voice that echoed through the sound system. "Thank you for waiting." Then he added something that wasn't in any planned speech, something that came straight from his aching but living heart. "I'm back." The ballroom erupted in a sincere, emotional, prolonged ovation. People clapped with tears in their eyes. Edward saw tough executives he had known for decades, discreetly wiping their eyes. And there in the back, almost invisible in the crowd, he saw Isabella and Mrs. Davis, hugging, crying together. That night, after the formal speeches and strategic conversations, Edward found Isabella waiting discreetly near the service exit. She was tired, her eyes red, but she was smiling. "You did it," was all she said. Edward knelt with effort, bringing himself to her height. "No, we did it," he corrected, "and I will never forget what you did for me." The days following the event at the Plaza Hotel were like waking from a long, confusing dream to find that reality was even better than any fantasy. Edward didn't immediately return to the wheelchair. That triumphant walk, as painful and difficult as it had proven something fundamental to both him and his body. He could walk, not perfectly, not without effort, not without pain, but he could. And once you prove to yourself that something is possible, going back becomes unthinkable. The story of his return spread quickly through the business circles of New York and then across the country. It wasn't cheap tabloid sensationalism seeking easy clicks. It was something different, more profound. People genuinely connected with the narrative of overcoming adversity, with the image of that powerful man who had fallen and chosen to get up instead of giving up. Respected newspapers published inspiring articles. Business magazines ran features on resilience and leadership in times of crisis. A popular entrepreneurship podcast requested an interview, which Edward surprisingly accepted. During that interview, sitting comfortably in a modern armchair in the Soho studio, still holding the silver cane but not constantly needing it for balance, Edward did something he had never done in nearly 3 decades of a highly public career. He was completely, brutally honest about his vulnerability. He spoke of the terrible months of absolute despair after the stroke, of the nights he lay awake staring at the ceiling wondering if it was worth continuing to try, of having discreetly planned to step away from everything, transfer funds, and gradually disappear from the world he had always known. He told them how he had lost not only the movement in his legs, but also the fundamental will to fight that had always defined him. And then, his voice thick with genuine emotion that he didn't try to hide or disguise, he told them about Isabella, without mentioning her name to protect her privacy as he had solemnly promised. He spoke of an extraordinary child who had appeared in his life exactly when he needed her most, when he was most lost and hopeless. A girl who had treatment techniques inherited from a grandmother who was an army nurse, ancient knowledge passed down through generations that modern medicine often scorns or ignores. A child who believed in him unconditionally when even the best doctors from the best universities no longer believed there was any real hope of recovery. The interviewer, an experienced man in his 40s who had hosted the show for over 10 years with respected and serious professionalism, had to pause the recording because he was visibly moved, his eyes glistening behind his modern framed glasses. When they resumed after a few minutes of respectful silence, he said something that Edward would carry with him forever, words that would become almost a personal mantra. True success, real and lasting success, isn't measured by how much you achieve when you're strong and everything is going your way. It's measured by how well you can get back up when you're completely on the floor, broken with no apparent strength to continue. Edward's company not only stabilized but began to thrive again in unexpected ways. The investors who had been nervous about his absence now showed a renewed, almost reverential confidence. New clients appeared, many openly saying they wanted to work with someone who had proven to have strength of character in addition to technical competence. Edward returned to the office 3 times a week, using his cane but walking through the hallways with growing dignity. The employees greeted him with a respect that was not just professional, but genuinely personal. He had become more than a distant boss. He had become human in their eyes. But the most important of all these external changes was the internal transformation Edward experienced daily. He began to see life through a completely different lens. The things that used to consume his time and energy, meetings about small percentage increases in profits, heated discussions about market strategies that would make a minimal difference in the bottom line, now seemed absurdly trivial. Not that they had ceased to matter completely. He was still a businessman, still had responsibilities, still needed to ensure the company remained profitable and competitive. But that was no longer everything. It was no longer enough. Edward started arriving at the office earlier so he could leave earlier. He began to delegate more, to trust that his team could make decisions without his constant supervision. And for the first time in decades, he began to have time for things that didn't generate profit, but generated meaning. Time to have a slow lunch, appreciating the food instead of swallowing sandwiches in front of the computer. Time to read books that weren't about business or economics. Time to simply sit in the mansion's garden and watch the birds, the clouds, the subtle changes in light as the day progressed. And of course, time for Isabella. The physical therapy sessions continued, but their nature subtly changed. It was no longer just physical work focused on muscle recovery. It had transformed into something closer to genuine companionship. Isabella came 3 times a week, as always, but now they spent more time talking than working. Edward would ask about school, about the subjects she liked, about the dreams she carried. She would tell him about the difficulties of being the poor kid in a school where many classmates had so much more, about the teachers who inspired and those who just punched the clock, about the fear of not getting into a university when the time came because she couldn't afford expensive prep courses. It was during one of these conversations, on a sunny November afternoon, when the garden was in full, fragrant bloom, that Edward made a decision that had been maturing for weeks. He had tried several times to offer money to Isabella and her mother, trying in both discreet and direct ways, but Mrs. Davis always politely refused, saying she already earned a fair wage for her cleaning work and wanted nothing more. Edward understood her pride, respected it deeply, but he also knew that this family deserved more than just a fair wage. They deserved security, opportunity, a future. So he prepared something different, something that couldn't be easily refused because it wasn't disguised charity, but a tangible acknowledgement of an unpayable debt. He had his lawyers prepare documents creating an irrevocable educational trust in Isabella's name. The trust would fully pay for all her education, from a quality private high school to university, including a master's and a doctorate if she wanted. In addition, he arranged for the deed to a small 3-bedroom house at the back of the mansion's property, originally built for a groundskeeper, but which had been empty for years. The house had a small but charming garden where one could plant flowers, exactly the kind of place Isabella once mentioned her grandmother had always dreamed of having. On the afternoon he decided to present all this, Edward was nervous in a way he hadn't been in years. It wasn't the nervousness of closing a multi-million-dollar deal. It was something more visceral, more important. He was afraid that Isabella and Mrs. Davis would refuse, that they would see it as an attempt to buy gratitude or to turn their genuine relationship into a commercial transaction. But he had to do it, not out of social obligation or convention, but because he simply couldn't imagine not doing it. When Isabella arrived for her session that day, Edward was waiting for her in the library, not the living room where they usually worked. There was a leather folder on the elegant mahogany desk, and next to it, a small box wrapped in simple paper. Isabella immediately sensed that something was different. She entered slowly, her backpack still on, her eyes curious but cautious. "Sit here," Edward asked, indicating the leather armchair next to his. "I need to talk to you about something important." Isabella sat on the edge of the armchair, her legs too short to fully reach the floor, swinging slightly in the air. Edward took a deep breath, searching for the right words that had seemed so clear when he rehearsed them mentally, but were now eluding him. "You know what you did for me," he began, his voice more emotional than he intended. "You gave me back not just the ability to walk, you gave me back the will to live. You taught me that strength isn't about never falling, but about always getting up. That's priceless. There's no way to repay it, but I have to try to do something that shows how much it mattered." He opened the folder and took out the educational trust documents, carefully explaining in detail what it meant. Isabella listened in absolute silence, her eyes widening as she understood the magnitude of what was being offered. When Edward finished, she sat still for a long moment, processing, and then said in a small but firm voice, "This is too much. It's way too much." "No," Edward replied with conviction, "it's not even close to enough, but it's what I can do. And I want to do it. Not out of obligation, Isabella, because I want you to have every opportunity you deserve. I want you to become the doctor you dream of being. I want you to prove your grandmother was right about everything." He then pushed the small box toward her. "This is something else. Open it." Isabella carefully took the box, undid the simple wrapping, and found inside a golden key attached to a carved wooden keychain. Along with the key was the deed to the small house at the back of the property. Edward explained about the garden, about how she and her mother could live there if they wanted. They would have privacy but also security, they wouldn't pay rent, they could plant the flowers her grandmother loved so much. Isabella held the key with both small hands, looking at that piece of golden metal as if it were the most precious object in the world. Tears began to stream silently down her face, wetting her already worn school uniform. Edward felt his chest tighten violently. He tried to say something, but she raised a hand, asking for silence. "Do you remember what you said on the first day?" she asked in a choked voice. "When I said I could make you walk again? You said you would give me everything you had if I could. I said I didn't want what you had. I wanted who you are." Edward nodded, perfectly remembering that moment that had changed everything. Isabella wiped her tears with the back of her hand and continued, now with a wet but genuine smile. You've already given me who you are. You gave me your attention when you were tired. You gave me respect when I was just a kid. You gave me your trust when everyone else doubted. You made me feel important. You taught me that ancient knowledge is worth as much as new technology. You gave me dignity. And now you're giving me opportunity too." She held the key against her chest, clutching it tightly as if afraid of losing it. "I'll accept," she said finally, "not because I deserve more than you've already given me, but because I know this is important to you, and because my mother deserves to have a safe place to sleep without worrying about rent every month. And because I really do want to be a doctor, and this will help a lot." Edward felt his own tears threatening to fall but managed to control them. He extended his hand to Isabella in a formal gesture, almost comical considering she was only 10. She understood the meaning, shook his hand with surprising firmness, and then did something unexpected. She jumped from the armchair and hugged him tightly, her thin arms around his neck, her face hidden in his shoulder, now crying openly without trying to hide it. Edward hugged her back, feeling the smallness of that body, the fragility, and at the same time the absurd strength of this child who had saved so much more than just his legs. They stayed like that for a time that felt both eternal and too brief. When they finally let go, both had red eyes but were smiling. Mrs. Davis was called to the library, and when Edward explained everything to her as well, the strong woman who had cleaned that house for months without ever complaining broke down in sobs of gratitude and disbelief. She tried to refuse initially, as Edward had expected, saying it was too much, that she didn't deserve it, that she was already paid well for her work. But Edward was firm. "It's not about deserving, Mrs. Davis. It's about justice. Your daughter gave me my life back. This is just a small thank you. Please, accept." And she accepted, hugging Edward with the strength of someone who could finally relax after years of carrying the weight of financial uncertainty alone. In the following months, life found a new rhythm that was simultaneously gentler and more meaningful than anything Edward had experienced in the last 30 years. Mrs. Davis and Isabella moved into the cozy, little house at the back of the property on a memorable sunny Saturday in December, when the typical New York summer heat was at its peak, but a pleasant breeze made everything more bearable. Edward helped where he could, given his physical limitations, carrying light boxes of clothes and books, arranging furniture under Mrs. Davis's careful supervision, feeling a simple, pure joy in doing honest manual labor that had absolutely nothing to do with complicated spreadsheets, market analyses, or strategic investments. The house quickly came to life, transforming from an empty, functional space into a warm, personality-filled home. Colorful curtains, in shades of yellow and blue, appeared in the windows, bringing in cheerful, filtered light. Plants began to sprout vigorously in the small but well-tended garden, seeds that Mrs. Davis planted with almost religious dedication. Cherry tomatoes, lettuce, basil, rosemary. The wonderful smell of lovingly seasoned home cooking began to regularly perfume that corner of the property that was once just an empty, decorative space with no real purpose. Edward was often invited for dinner at the little house, and those simple meals around the modest wooden table became some of the most precious moments of his entire week. Mrs. Davis cooked traditional Southern comfort food she had learned from her own mother: fried chicken with collard greens, mac and cheese, cornbread. Edward ate slowly, savoring each bite not just for the delicious food, but for the warm atmosphere, the genuine conversations, the feeling of belonging to something bigger than himself. There at that simple table, he wasn't the millionaire entrepreneur Edward Taylor. He was just Edward, the man who almost gave up but chose to fight, the man who found family in the most unexpected places. Edward and Isabella continued their physical therapy sessions, but now they were more like meetings between friends than medical treatment. His physical recovery had reached a stable plateau. He didn't walk perfectly, probably never would. The cane became a permanent companion. There were days when the pain was worse and he needed more rest. But he was functional, independent, dignified. And that was infinitely more than he had hoped for when he was trapped in that chair months ago, believing his life was effectively over. Isabella enrolled in a top private high school on the Upper West Side, an institution known for preparing students well for competitive college entrance exams. On her first day of school, Edward made a point of taking her personally, driving the adapted car he had bought when he realized he could drive again with a few modifications. He watched her walk through that gate carrying a new backpack, an impeccable uniform, and a confidence that had nothing to do with money but with knowing she was capable. Months turned into years with that strange speed that time has of passing slowly, day to day, but quickly when you look back. Isabella flourished at her new school. Her grades were exceptional, especially in biology and chemistry. Teachers wrote in reports that she had a natural gift for the health sciences, a rare ability to understand not just the theory, but the practical application of knowledge. Edward read every report with a pride that rivaled any feeling he had ever had for any of his own professional achievements. Edward also changed profoundly over this transformative time. He sold a significant portion of his shares in the company he built from scratch, keeping just enough to have a decisive voice in the most important strategic meetings, but freeing up precious time and mental energy for other things that now mattered much more. He began to dedicate more financial resources and, more importantly, more emotional energy to causes that made a tangible difference in people's lives. He created a robust, non-profit foundation focused specifically on the rehabilitation of people with all types of motor disabilities, especially those who lacked the financial resources to pay for expensive treatments at private clinics or imported adaptive equipment. The foundation he created offered completely free physical therapy with highly qualified professionals, state-of-the-art adaptive equipment, motorized wheelchairs for those who needed them, custom orthotics, and something equally important that no money could directly buy, but that made all the difference in the recovery process: real hope. Hope based on concrete examples of overcoming adversity. Edward personally visited the institute at least twice a week, talked at length with patients undergoing rehabilitation, shared his own complete story without omitting the most difficult and desperate moments, and proved with his simple physical presence, with his cane, with his still imperfect but functional steps, that recovery was absolutely possible, even when it seemed impossible. Many patients cried when they met him in person, moved to see that the famous entrepreneur Edward Taylor, the man who appeared on magazine covers and gave keynotes at international events, had also been through the hell of a wheelchair, had also fought against his own body, had also almost given up. That identification was powerful, therapeutic in itself. "If he could do it, I can do it too," was the phrase Edward heard repeatedly, and every time he heard it, he felt his heart swell with gratitude for being able to be a source of inspiration. The inspiration for the foundation had, of course, come from Isabella and her grandmother. Edward wanted to honor that lineage of care that had saved both his father decades ago and himself recently. He wanted to name the foundation the Augusta Institute, in honor of the army nurse grandmother. But Isabella asked him not to, saying her grandmother always preferred to work behind the scenes, that she wouldn't want her name in big letters. So Edward chose a more symbolic name, the Next Step Institute. Every person who walked in there received a clear message. It doesn't matter how many times you've fallen. What matters is being willing to take the next step. The relationship between Edward and Beatrice also found some sort of balance over time. She never explicitly apologized for the episode with Dr. Miller, but she began to show a silent acceptance of her brother's choices. She started visiting him regularly, sometimes bringing her children, whom Edward barely knew. The kids loved the mansion, the huge garden, and especially loved it when Isabella showed up and told them stories about medicinal plants and ancient healing techniques her grandmother had taught her. Beatrice watched these interactions with an expression Edward couldn't quite decipher, something between admiration and perhaps a touch of envy, for the obvious bond he had formed with that girl. One day, on a particularly beautiful autumn afternoon when the leaves were starting to turn yellow and fall, creating a golden carpet in the garden, Edward was sitting on a wooden bench under a flowering dogwood tree, watching Isabella show his nephews how to identify edible plants, when Beatrice sat down beside him. "You seem happy," she said simply, without beating around the bush. Edward thought for a moment before answering. "I am." happier than I've been in a long time. Maybe happier than I've ever been in my entire life, to be honest. Even with the cane, even knowing you'll never walk perfectly again." Edward looked at the silver cane leaning against the bench beside him. "Funny you should ask that," he said with a half smile. "Because the answer is yes, precisely because of the cane. It reminds me every day of what I survived, what I achieved, who helped me. Before the stroke I had everything, but I had nothing. Now I have fewer things, but so much more meaning." Beatrice was silent, processing that. Then she said something surprising. "I envy you, Edward. You found a purpose. I'm still looking." Edward looked at his sister with renewed understanding. "It's never too late, Bea. It's never too late to start over, to find what matters. I learned that at 52 trapped in a wheelchair. You can learn it at 41 with 2 perfectly good legs." They laughed together, and in that moment, some of the ice that had formed between them finally melted completely. The years continued to pass with that mix of routine and surprises that characterizes a life well lived. Isabella finished high school with excellent grades and was accepted into the pre-med program at NYU, one of the most competitive universities in the country. Edward was there at her high school graduation ceremony, clapping louder than any other parent when she went on stage to receive her diploma and the award for valedictorian. Mrs. Davis cried openly, not caring about her running mascara, holding Edward's hand as if he were family, because in a way, he was. In college, Isabella excelled again. Her undergraduate research thesis was on the integration of traditional and modern medicine in the treatment of neurological injuries, a work naturally born from her experience with Edward and her grandmother's teachings. The paper was so well received that it was published in a specialized journal, a rare feat for an undergraduate student. Edward read that article at least 20 times, each time finding new reasons to be proud. Throughout all these years, Edward kept walking. Not just physically, although he made a point to walk for at least 30 minutes every day, regardless of the pain, using it as a moving meditation. But he also walked metaphorically, always forward, always progressing. He never forgot where he came from, never stopped being grateful for every step he could take. And then, 6 years after that first strange encounter, when a 10-year-old girl said she could make him walk again, Edward and Isabella met again, in that same garden where it had all begun. She was now 16, no longer that thin child with messy braids. She was a young woman, still small, but with a presence that filled any room she entered. She was wearing the white coat of a pre-med student, having just come from a volunteer shift at the university hospital. They walked together through the garden that Mrs. Davis kept impeccable, now full of the flowers she had always dreamed of planting. Roses, lilies, geraniums, jasmine. The scent was almost intoxicating. Edward still used his cane, still limped slightly, but he walked. And as they walked side by side, Isabella said something that made Edward stop in his tracks. "You know what I realized studying neurology in college?" she asked, looking at her own hands as if seeing them for the first time. "The techniques my grandmother used, that I used on you, they have a real scientific basis. It's not mysticism. It's neuroplastic stimulation. It's reactivating neural pathways through specific pressure. The points she taught me correspond exactly to the locations of major nerves. She knew science without ever having formally studied it. She was an intuitive scientist." Edward smiled. "Your grandmother was wise, and you inherited that wisdom, but you added formal knowledge. It's the perfect combination." Isabella nodded, and then said with that seriousness Edward knew so well, "I want to continue this work. In my residency, I'm going to focus on physical medicine and rehabilitation. I want to scientifically prove that ancient techniques have value. I want to bring together the best of both worlds, and when I graduate, I want to work at the Next Step Institute. I want to help other people like I helped you." Edward felt his eyes burn but managed to hold back the tears this time. He looked at this young woman who had saved his life when she was just a child and said in a firm voice, filled with pride and gratitude, "You're already helping. Just by existing, just by being who you are, you're already changing the world, and I'll be here to support you every step of the way." They continued walking, their steps synchronized, one supporting the other, in ways that went far beyond the physical, as the sun slowly set over New York, painting the sky in shades of orange, pink, and purple, promising a new day that would come as it always did, full of possibilities for those brave enough to take one more step. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Edward and Isabella has deeply touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of resilience, gratitude, and transformation, please hit that like button right now, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any stories like this one, and let us know in the comments which moment marked you the most in this unforgettable journey. Was it Edward's courage entering that event? Was it Isabella's determination to believe when no one else did? Or was it that deep connection between two souls who found in each other exactly what they needed at the right moment? Every day, we bring you intense and true stories like this one, revealing the deepest, most beautiful, and most resilient side of the human soul. Stories that remind us that it's never too late to start over, that hope can appear in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the greatest gift we can give or receive has nothing to do with money. We'll see you in the next episode with another story that will stir your emotions and make you reflect on what truly matters in life.